Today, John Jemison is with us from Maine, and he's going to be talking about resinous hemp production. I think focusing quite a bit on fertility and some other topics as well, I'm sure. And John's been working in hemp now for a couple of years, I believe, and took a whole sabbatical out to Colorado and got a chance to work on hemp and potatoes, I think, probably both. I will turn it over to you, John.
Okay, thank you guys. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the sort of some things that I'm thinking about with the industry, and then a little bit on soil management and fertility practices. I don't know how many people here are thinking about growing for the first time, but some of this will be applicable to you, and then to other people it'll pick up, I think, on basically following up on what you already probably know, at least a little bit, and build on that. So I will say Happy New Year. I think I was looking at this thing last night. It was a letter to the year 2021, and it said, look, you know, you don't have to be the best year, you just have to be better than last year. And I thought that was pretty good. It's like, you got this, 21, you got this. But I think I've been putting together a class for the University of Maine, and it's been really fun to go look at sort of at the history of hemp and where it and how it got developed. And I love this comment by Carl Sagan, who said it would be really interesting if in human history the cultivation of cannabis generally led to the invention of agriculture and therefore to civilization. And in my first class that I'm going to do at the university, I spent a lot of time talking about how the plant would have been found by Homo erectus moving out of Africa and up into the steppe region of China and southern Russia, and how they would have run into this plant, and how it would have been such a godsend plant to so many people. You know, they likely could have used the fiber in just tons and tons and tons of different possible uses. And then, you know, they would have found that the seed was pretty nutritious and useful and tasty. And then they would have had to get that seed out of that seed head, and they would have probably used their hands to do that. And as anybody that has ever handled seed heads of hemp, you'll realize then that would get your hands all nice and black and dirty. And that, I think, is how we ended up starting out with this resinous hemp industry, which we have today. And so basically, I think it's an amazing plant. Is it a miracle plant? I remember people standing up in 2016 when I first started working with the crop at some of our Department of Agriculture meetings, and they would say, you know, this plant, it doesn't need fertility, it doesn't get diseases. It is truly a miracle plant. And if that's your thinking, then you better rethink that, because I don't think that's the case. But I think in terms of what I think the plant can do and what the cannabinoids in the plant can do are pretty phenomenal. And I'm going to end the talk today talking about the fact that we need more research to do this, but we certainly need, you know, we have a surprising number of people in the world will have a seizure or multiple seizures in their lifetime. Anxiety, I think, you know, anxiety seems to be a prevalent problem, and both of these tend to be helped by CBD, which is a really good thing. Is it the answer to all health problems? Probably not. And again, is it immune to the basic principles of crop management? It is absolutely not. So we will talk about some of those things today. And I thought it would be interesting to just kind of hit on a couple of the things that we saw this year, and kind of how I see us positioned, because I got to spend 2019 in Southern Colorado. And I really got a different perspective on things. And if we're going to be able to really make it in New England, we really have to increase the demand for locally grown products that are grown in a very astute and careful manner. And then we'll get into some of that as we go along. So this year, moisture is when you spend a summer in southern Colorado and they get 7 inches of moisture a year, and all of the water that they use for crop production comes out of snowmelt from the mountains and pulling out of the Rio Grande River. You really begin to appreciate that it is a gift, but it's also a challenge for us here. And I think the biggest problem that we had this year, I mean, it was such a great year. It was a dry year, but it was also really humid. And I think most people probably recognize this, and powdery mildew was a real problem for, I saw it in every field that I went into. I didn't see it in every variety as much as I did in some varieties, and particularly the white variety was a real problem. It was a CBG line, and it just does not seem to do particularly well in our environment. Another thing that I saw a fair amount of this year was this, and I had been in this farm in 2017, and I noticed a little bit of this, and then I was gone. Or 2018, I saw a little bit of this, and then 2019 I was gone, and now in 2020, and they are rotating on this farm, but the problem does seem to be growing, and septoria leaf spot's gonna continue to be an issue as we move forward, I think, because it does seem to be spreading. But what's really interesting to me is the amount of variability within a variety on how it responds to the pressure. And I think it kind of addresses a bigger picture that, our genetics in this industry are very young, and not particularly stable in a lot of areas. And so, like, what I would see in this field is you might have down a row, and that maybe 2 or 3 of these rows were the same variety. You'd have 2 or 3 plants that looked really good, 2 of them that were just baked, and then another one that would look good, and then the next 2 would be baked. So I think one of the things we're going to need is better genetics moving forward, and a strong effort, I hope supported by USDA, to improve the genetics that we have available to us. Another disease that I typically see a lot of, and I think I can probably count the amount of this I saw on 2 hands, and is bud rot or gray mold. And that's always going to be a problem for us. If we could get more resistance to gray mold, leaf spot, I think we would do a lot better. I don't think there's any resistance buildup that we can do much of for the second problem here, this being the chill blight, if you will. We had 3 nights. We almost always get a cold snap at the end of September. I've been going to Caleb's festival at Mafka for years, and it seems like it's always the 3rd weekend in September, and we've always had a frost by this time. Now, most of the time hemp can handle one chilly night, but if you get down to 3 chilly nights like we did in September, we were down like 28, 27 for 3 nights in a row, and that pretty much wiped out a lot of the production. So that was a real problem for us. The other big problem I see moving forward that I think has absolutely no basis whatsoever in science or really anything else. And I wrote to USDA. I had long conversations with people on the phone about their rules, and I think this new rule is going to be really hard for us to deal with in New England. And it comes partly due to the cost of production here and relative to elsewhere, and I'll get into that in just a minute. But I think everybody understands the new rule and what it's going to do to us. And my analogy for why this rule makes no sense. I mean, as I understand it, someone at some point needed to designate the difference between high THC cannabis and hemp, And so they pulled a number out and they said, well, you know, we don't see in the grain and the fiber, we never see anything over about 0.2 or 3. So let's call it 0.3. And that was what they were going to use. And then USDA came in, and I think their basis for wanting this is more for, you know, catching people that are cheating as much as anything else. As that's the only thing I can come up with. But my basis for thinking this is like, okay, so Heather comes into work and after lunch, and she's coming in and drinking a kombucha, you know, and Scott and Catherine are going to look at her and say, huh, you should be enjoying their kombucha there. That's great. And you wouldn't even blink. And we know there's a little bit of alcohol in that. But if she came in with a bottle of, you know, East Bench Zinfandel in the afternoon, you might say, Heather, you're having a bad day. You know, it's 15 or 16% alcohol. Well, you know, high THC cannabis and low THC cannabis is pretty much like this. And there's even more to that, in that 1% alcohol, if, you know, you'd have to drink a whole bunch of kombucha to ever feel it. But if you were consuming CBD cannabis that had 1% THC in it, it would have really very little impact, because as we know, THC has its effect on our body by changing the flow of neurotransmitters across this nerve synapse. And it happens because the THC fits in this little receptor molecule or receptor area called the CB1 receptor. And when you have lots and lots of CBD in the system, it doesn't interact with that receptor in the same way, but it will affect THC's capacity to bind in that. And that's an important thing. So interesting to me anyway, that, so I think you could have easily up to 1% and never ever feel it or never see an issue with it. And for once in my life, I have a political affiliation with someone that is conservative and libertarian, because Rand Paul has put a bill into the Senate to push the limit to 1% total THC. And I think that would make a lot of sense, because I don't think we can grow CBD plants in New England that are now more than about 6 or 8% total CBD and not push the limit. And that's the big issue. The other thing I think is an important thing to think about is demand, and how much CBD does one person actually need to in a given year. And so if you were going to grow a plant for yourself, like I grew this plant in my backyard. This is a Charlotte's Angel, named after Charlotte Figge, who was one of the people that died from the COVID problems this year. And she had a big seizure problem. And so the Charlotte's Web line came from her. And this plant was a beast. It was about chest high and about as wide as it was tall, and really quite dense. And so when I harvested it, and it too got some powdery mildew, so I harvested it about 2 weeks earlier than I typically would have, because I just wanted to have disease-free plants. And I sent it in for analysis, and this is what I found. I found that we had about 11% total CBD, or 11.5%. Total cannabinoids, about 14.5%. And, but the total THC was 0.5%. So this would not have passed if it had been out there in the world. And I grew another plant, Maize Canatonic, which we grow a lot of, and about 2 years ago. And that one happened to have about almost 20% total CBD and about 0.7%, or almost 0.8% total THC. So, so I think the point is the amount of CBD that's in both of these plants would swamp any impact of any possible THC that you might find. And interestingly, I thought it would be kind of curious to see what one plant would do for you. And so I harvested up my plant, I trimmed it all up, and I ended up with about 245 grams, or about a half a pound of dried, cured, trimmed flower. And I have had a seizure in my life and I do not want another one. So I've been consuming about 5 milligrams of CBD every day. And I was curious to kind of calculate out how far would one plant get me. So at home, I make these really super healthy CBD gummies, and I take elderberry concentrate and blueberry concentrate, lemon juice, lemon zest, honey, fresh ginger, turmeric, and it's got all this really good stuff in it. And I eat 2 of these little guys a day. And so by my calculations, I cook these and I add gelatin to make them firm up. And so each 7-gram gummy has about 2.5 milligrams of CBD. And so my daily dose, I get about a 1/10 of a milligram of THC in this. So there's, again, 20 times more CBD than THC. And I've never, ever felt a thing with this. And so, and the other thing that's interesting is that a 1 ounce of dried flower lasts me about 50 days in terms of what I make for gummies. So one plant will last me well more than a year. So one plant is really all I need. And I'm a regular consumer of this particular plant. And then I go out to farms and I'm standing out in the field that has, 11,000 plants in it. And I'm thinking, wow, we got to, okay, so I'm doing the math in my head going, this is going to be challenging. And then I think about what we had out west, where we had circles, 120-acre circles filled with CBD cannabis, planted much more densely because they can do that there, and then they can just harvest and let dry in the field. And this was the amount of cannabis produced by one farm in Southwest, in Southern Colorado, that I worked with this year. So that's, to me, speaks to the problem that we have. And even though people are finding this plant to be useful to them, I have aches and pains, and I think it helps them. And certainly there's plenty of literature coming out that shows that cannabis is an emerging treatment for common symptoms in older adults, and that, many of them have tried it. I think in this society that we have, we're kind of an Advil society, and we want to take something, we want to get quickly and then be done with it and hope that it's fixed, instead of being like a supplement that you take every day for over time, and hopefully it improves things. So I think if we're going to make it in this industry here, I think we really need more research to show positive benefits and taking it for a long time. And then we really need to connect people to local production that's being done really, really well in this sort of uber organic manner. And I think that would be really helpful to us. So that's really one of the things I wanted to talk about, was just how much I think these USDA rules are going to disproportionately hurt us in the Northeast, because we can't have enough CBD in each plant to have it make a difference. I think they did it to stop cheaters, but we have a super expensive plant to grow. And I thought this was kind of interesting in itself, that out here in California, there was a field that they went in and tested, and they found it was quote unquote well over. They never specified whether it was 0.5 or 0.7 or 1 or 15, but they just said it was well over. And then they went and plowed this whole field down. And now Kern County has a $1 billion lawsuit from the company that owns the land in Indiana. So I think there's something going on, and I don't know why USDA wants to be so difficult with this. And so even though there is a fair amount of love, even in this kind of dark environment, there is a lot of love for this plant, and people still want to grow it. And so that's really what I want to talk about mostly today is people are excited, who should do it. And so when I get a lot of phone calls, I'm sure Heather does too, of people that they call and it's springtime and they say, hey, I've got some land and I want to grow some hemp. And so I try to walk through a series of, quick questions to ask them. Is this land that you want to grow on, is it already in active production, or is it a hay field? What kind of drainage do you have? What kind of equipment do you have? Do you have tractors? Do you have plastic? Do you have a greenhouse to start things in? What kind of production background do you have? And you'd be amazed at the number of people that say, you know, no to all of these questions, and yet they are completely convinced that they're going to be able to grow hemp. It is amusing to me. And so I've spent a lot of time trying to talk some people out of that. But if they are people that have had some farming experience, particularly if they ever grew medical or recreational cannabis, at least they understand the plant and that it is not an easy plant to grow or grow well. It's an easy plant to grow. It's not an easy plant to grow well. And so the other things I like to ask about are things like, what kind of cultural pest management skills do you have? If you see an insect on your plant, are you going to have any idea what it might be? Do you understand IPM? Do you have some good organic production experience? Because really, I mean, I'm still a firm believer that we really need to be spending our time growing this organically. And do you have some irrigation experience? And if they have that, you know, that's good. And then I guess the next question you really got to ask them is, do you have some backers? Because this is not an inexpensive plant to grow. And can you afford a loss? And I've known a lot of people that, you know, they get contracts and, you know, they'll have something that's set up. They got somebody that's going to buy, and then the buyers ghost on them. And it's an issue. And so I think the people that are going to make it and do the best in this industry is that person that wants to grow and then make their own products. They have a good connection. They're well known in their community and within the state. And if you can build and keep a reputation of quality, I think that's really the key that we're going to need moving forward. And that's just my opinion for what it's worth. But those are some of the things that I've been thinking about a lot. And I too have had some kind of long evenings where I've been trying to go to sleep at night too, worrying about all kinds of different things. And these are some of the things I think about. Because I really want to see this industry go. And I do believe this is good. It's good medicine. It's a good supplement. And it can be helpful to people. We just got to figure out how to make it work. So what I'd like to talk about now is some of the soil management things I want people to think about, and what kind of soil fertility practices we need to be thinking about to do a really good job with this plant. And the first thing I think we need to think about is site location. And I think both back to, I mean, Heather's done a really great job to go out to people and say, well, you know, you can't change your soil. You really can't. I mean, if you have a heavy clay soil, and you know, you're gonna have a rough time with this particular crop. I think it does not like wet feet, and so if you're uncertain about your soil type and what you're going to be working with, you can always go to the Web Soil Survey, which is available to everybody. We just bought some land in Southern Colorado at the end of the sabbatical at that time. And so I went on the Web Soil Survey. I figured out what kind of soil type we had. Do we have any building limitations and things like that? And you can go down and find your farm and where you're thinking about growing. And particularly if you're thinking, if you have 2 or 3 different soil types, you can find that on a map. And you can zero right into the field that you wanted to grow in. And so, for example, if this happens to be the Rogers farm in Maine, owned by the university, where we do a lot of cropping, and I might say, well, I have the chance to grow in this particular field for a research plot. Would I want to do that? And if you dig down, you might find that, well, that soil is somewhat poorly drained. I think I actually have a little more background in that particular field, so I know it's not a bad field, but it isn't we don't have really great well-drained soils except up in one corner of our farm. So that's where I would choose to grow it if I could. An ideal situation, I thought one of our farmers that I worked with in 2017 and in 2018 had a beautiful field. It was nice and flat. dark sandy loam river bottom, received years and years and years of cow manure, beautiful soil, and I think it could be, this is the kind of soil type you might really want to be looking for. But could there also be another problem with being down in this river bottom ground? Yeah, you might flood, and that if you had a flooding event, that might be a potential problem. But I'm thinking about yet one more, in that a lot of fields tend to be surrounded by trees. And if we don't get a good wind flow, I think we run into some real problems with moisture. And that's what we were seeing where we saw that septorial leaf blight, leaf spot problem. Because if particularly in a river bottom, that the moisture can kind of sink down to that river bottom and just hang there. And if you don't get a good breeze, it can be problematic. Where I saw the best conditions on the farms that we visited this year, they were tended to be upland fields that were well drained, and they had good breeze blowing across that field. Every time I've ever seen anybody growing any cannabis, there's always a fan blowing on it. There's always air moving in the production facilities. And I think that's one of the things that cannabis would just like to have. And it's one of the reasons I think my plant this year had powdery mildew, is because my garden is surrounded by trees and it doesn't get much wind flow either. So those are some of the things to think about if you're considering going into this and you're looking to locate your spot. If you have a breezy area with well-drained soils, that's a good start. The second thing we want to think about is not treating our soil like dirt. And the time to have made some real production decisions should not be in April or early May to say, yes, I'm going to go do this. Ideally we would do this in the summer or the fall, late summer or the fall. And I think most people would sort of figure out why. But let's say, if I decided I wanted to use this field, and I'm taking my last little cut of hay off of it, the time to deal with that is at that point, because you might want to go out and take a soil sample from that field. You might need to see what it looks like and how it's doing out there, and that would be an important thing. And then if you find that you need to lime, then you can get a truck in there, get the lime spread. And I would tell you right off the bat, anything with a pH of less than 5.8, you really should be thinking about liming out there. And you don't have to lime to too high a pH, but at least get some lime out there. And that's the time to do it, because you're likely then going to need to flip that soil and let it sit and let it mellow over the winter. And then you can go in and work that field. But too often I have found that farmers, they'll decide in April or even early May that they're going to take on a field. And at that point in time, those fields are generally pretty doggone wet. You can't get into them. And then they just beat them to death until they can get the soil in a plantable condition. And then they go out and work it. And that's really not the best way to approach it. So from a soil management perspective, I think this would be ideal. And then you could flip that in the fall, come into the spring, work it up a couple of times, and you'd probably be in pretty good shape to get going. One of the things you also need to think about this particular plant, is that it is an accumulator. And I've done we can grow 3 plants at home in a home garden in Maine. And so I've done a lot of work with gardeners to let them know that you really have to test your soil. You have to know that you don't have lead. You have to know that you don't have metals and that could have been associated with the house or the construction of the house, or lead-based paints or things like that, because this plant is an accumulator. And if you've had a field that's had a history of wood ash or sludge application, this plant will take it up, and it just does that. And it's been used as a radioactivity remediator plant in certain parts of the world. So that's something you want to think about. It is an important thing. So we now can test soils for hemp production, and we analyzed some 98 samples this last year, and I'll use some of that to kind of look at what kind of soil conditions we're seeing. But I would certainly, if I had any question at all, if that field had received anything other than cow manure over a bunch of years, or animal manure over a bunch of years, I would certainly consider looking into that. Our crop code is we have a 130 industrial hemp code, and I know for sure that we have people that send soil samples in that are growing for other purposes, because you can look at the organic matter content, their indoor production for another type of crop similar to, related to CBD hemp, but not CBD hemp. But anyway, as we look at what we found in the 2020 crop code designation, again, we had 98 samples and the average pH was 5.8. And so to me, growing hemp outdoors in soil, that is too low. You're going to have a fair amount of aluminum activity. And I have never actually, seen how much impact aluminum has on hemp, but most of the time aluminum is toxic to root growth. And that's one of the reasons why we lime. And in that liming process, free aluminum becomes gibbsite and it becomes unavailable. So that helps to take care of that problem. We also know that phosphorus is more available at a more near neutral pH, and that's useful. And again, if you've got metals in a more acidic environment, they're usually more plant available and it will be sucked up. So another way to make that, if you possibly could have history, liming that field will make that a little less plant available. But ideally, I would recommend to people to shoot for a soil pH of about 6.2 to 6.4, 6.5. I wouldn't go more than 6.5, and 6.4, 6.3 is probably fine. And I think you'll see good plant availability with that. In terms of soil organic matter, again, when you see a 43% or a 44% soil organic matter content, that's a pretty good clue that someone's growing a plant in the pot, not growing out in the field. But we did see an average of about 7.3. That might have been somewhat influenced by that super high value. But I think we would like to see people growing in soils that are anywhere from 5 to 10% organic matter. If you've got a happy garden soil and you want to grow your own CBD plant like I do, that would be an ideal range to shoot for. The lowest we had was about 1%. So I'm thinking that's a pretty sandy loam, pretty well managed or a well used soil without a lot of organic addition. And I think you would definitely be benefited by that. In terms of nitrogen sources, there are lots of organic nitrogen sources out there, and anything you can do to build soil organic matter in the process of feeding your plants is always a positive. That's why I've always been so supportive of organic production systems all my whole career. But certainly manure as a source is great. It can help build soil organic matter. Bedded manures and things like that are really good. Chicken manure is not so, it's a great nitrogen source, but it's not going to build soil organic matter for you. And when you do apply organic matter, you get ammonium and organic nitrogen. It's also a very good source of phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur. So that's always a positive. And as you build soil organic matter, then that organic matter will mineralize through the course and feed your plant over time. And so I think there's a great need for us to better understand how much nitrogen is needed and to have a tool that would tell us in the year how things are going for us. And so that's one of the things we have a grant to try to look at this a little bit more. If it gets funded, that will be something we will work on. But So anytime you can build soil organic matter, that's a good thing. What do we know about the nutrient? We know that the plant will rob it from the lower part of the plant and take it to the growing part of the plant. So if you're going to start to look for a nitrogen issue, then that's what you'd want to be thinking about, is looking at that part of the lower part of the plant. And these are, initial and then intermediate. You'll see 3 plants associated with these, and you can kind of get a sense of the extremity of the lack of the nutrient and the amount of a deficiency. But it's highly mobile in the plant. We need it for just about everything. So energy compounds, genetics, amino acids, chlorophyll, the whole game. And we can need about 4% in the leaf tissue. So I hope at some point we will finally get word that that the University of Maine can run plant tissue samples. That would be a really nice thing. I've been pushing them, but they've been a little pokey on giving the thumbs up for that, but all in good time. And at the university, we give people a flat rate of about 150 pounds to the acre. That might end up being a little bit high, and we'll show you some data that Heather's collected here in a minute to support that. But I think when most people grow cannabis indoors for either the medical industry or recreational, they like to have a fair amount of nitrogen early in the productions in the vegetative state. And then as the plant goes into flower and then works its way to harvest, they'd like to have the phosphorus levels be higher and the nitrogen levels going lower. And so that's hard to do in a production system like ours, where we're using an organic source. It's hard to get that nitrogen up front and then fade away. So if you can, if you're doing some transplanting in, and you can add a little more organic nitrogen at the planting time, that's probably a good thing, because it's going to tend to mineralize more as that season warms and you get into August, when you get the hot days and it begins to flower. It's kind of hard to tell the soil to stop mineralizing. So that's something to think about. And we generally recommend about 50 to 100 pounds maximum of P2O5 and K2O. So again, as you're growing out there in the field, look low for a nitrogen problem. Realize it's going to move it up to the top of the plant. And if you're going to use manure, solid manure, as a rough rule of thumb, is going to give you about 10 pounds of total nitrogen per ton, and about 6 pounds of P2O5 and about 10 pounds of K2O. So we also know that as we do this over time, we'll build the soil phosphorus and potassium levels, because the plant needs more nitrogen than it does phosphorus, but the balance in the manure is more to equal than that. So if we're going to use liquid manure, then I think we can count on, a book value of about 25 to 30 pounds of TKN, or total Keldol nitrogen, in the manure, out of which about 14 pounds of that's going to be organic, and about 14 pounds is going to be mineral nitrogen and readily available. So kind of keep these things in mind. And that organic nitrogen, about 35% of that typically will be made available in that first year. And then it's a decay curve after that, like 10, 5, 2 in years and years to follow. So if you've been in a field that has received organic manure for decades, you can count on a fair amount of mineralization out of that organic nitrogen pool, and that'll be good. So in terms of a research base for cannabis nitrogen demand, Heather's team has really been the only provider of that in the Northeast at least that I have found. We have a grant together that we put into SARE to look at nitrogen and look at some nitrogen testing, which I think would be useful. And we're going to try to do 5 rates of nitrogen, 2 locations over 3 years if we get funded. But at least in Heather's work, she's been able to show that nitrogen doesn't have a great impact on plant height. The plant's going to be about the same height, but the weight is influenced, and we need more data in this. But I think the most important thing that we're really trying to grow for out there isn't the whole plant that we're really concerned about. We're really concerned about the bud weight. And that did seem to be solidly leaning towards, about 125 to 150 pounds of nitrogen would be good. And so look at your year. And if you've had a super wet year or a super cold year, you're not getting much mineralization, it might be worth trying to supplement some way or another. But trying to shoot for about 125 to 150 pounds to the acre, I think would be kind of what we're looking to do. And certainly with the hemp flower bud, again, I think the data would support here the dry matter flower yield that about 125 to 150 should do the trick. So if you're going to do this, I would, you might spread some aged manure in the fall, particularly if you're turning under a sod. If you had some and you could spread it on that field and then flip it, that would help the sod break down a little more. Or if your field's already in production, you could spread some aged manure in the fall, work that into the soil, then plant a cover crop like oats that would winter kill for you. And then you could just come in and work the field in the spring and add your nitrogen. That might work pretty well. You can drip irrigate with fish emulsion. That's another thing you might do if you needed some. It's expensive, but it might work for you. And then just keep an eye on things, watch your plants, study them all the time if you can. I think that's good. We have a partnership grant that we're looking this year at whether or not we planted winter rye and oats. And the peas and oats will winter kill, and the winter rye, we're going to either roller crimp it or sickle bar mow it and see how that might serve as a weed management practice. So that should be that is a study that is funded, and we will be definitely doing that at the Rogers Farm and another farm in Maine. Let's look at some other data that we collected here real quick. We found that our phosphorus, this was a fun value when I did the data on this one. We had 144 was the average value, and that was influenced by this super high value. I have seen over 2,500 pounds of modified Morgan phosphorus in a couple of soils that were located very close to a big poultry facility in my career, but I've never seen anything this high. So I don't know what this person did. I got to think some math there's a little mathematical error there somewhere, but even at 144, if 40 is considered optimum, then this is super out of the park. Again, likely influenced by that big value, but so we don't need that much phosphorus. And if that field is erodible, that could be a problem for you. In soils, phosphorus is highly immobile, so it only moves by diffusion. So it really helps to have the roots kind of run into it almost. And it tends to be mobile in the plant. So again, you're going to look kind of at the lower middle part of the plant if you think you're going to see a problem. You need about 1/10 of what you had in, if we needed 4% in the leaf tissue for nitrogen, we need about 1/10 that in the plant with phosphorus. And that's why we end up building phosphorus up in soils and run into the problems that we have. But phosphorus is important, and your soil pH, again, we're going to manage soil pH around phosphorus because we had that 4.3 soil pH value. That you're not going to get much phosphorus availability with that kind of low soil pH. That's why we need to line to 6.2 to 6.5. That gets us in a pretty good place where we want to be. So if you're going to look for phosphorus deficiency, you might look lower and on the middle of that plant. Look for purpling or kind of a wetted area. I have seen a little bit of that in a couple of fields, but not very much. And it's going to be, if you don't have enough phosphorus, you will have poor flower development, delayed maturity, and reduced yield. So that's not ideal either. So we don't want that. In terms of the other nutrients, calcium, magnesium, and potassium, I have values here, the average values here presented for each of these nutrients, and then the recommended value. And so I think probably the most important one that's come out is this at 48. You know, if out of the average soil test value only had 48% calcium, that really does suggest to me that we need to work on this. We'd like this to be at least 70. And so you're solid 20% short. So we need to align with that. The highest was 95%. That's probably too high. We'd like it to be 60 to 80. The lowest was 2. I can't believe there could be a field with only 2% calcium on the exchange site, but if you have super low pH, that could explain that. Magnesium, the magnesium was looking pretty good at 10%. It could use a little bump, but not too bad. And at 32%, you might start to see some issues, but not too much. And then with potassium, we were kind of right where we want to be on the average. If you have a soil test value of 0.8, then you definitely should add some. If you have 18, that's too high. And I can almost guarantee you that if you're up at 18% on the exchange, then you're going to have some deficiencies in calcium and magnesium, because there is this competitive interaction. As we increase our potassium fertilization rate, it can depress the amount of calcium and magnesium uptake in that plant. So that can be a bit of an issue for you. So what do we look for in a field if we kind of rolled the dice and didn't put any fertilizer down that would have a fair amount of potassium in it? We might see that, we might begin to see some firing on the edges of the cannabis leaf. And then the leaf will become more and more chlorotic, and then it'll just kind of begin to burn up. So we need less potassium in the tissue than we do nitrogen, but not much. So we need about half as much as we need in nitrogen, generally speaking, or 3/4 as much as we needed for nitrogen. It's very, very important in the plant to move sugars around. It's super important for water relations. It really helps open and close stomates in that role. It's mobile in the plant, so again, look low for a problem. And it's often confused with hopper burn, leaf hopper burn. So keep that in mind, that if you put your fertilizer down or your nutrient source down and you think you should have had enough, make sure you don't have leaf hopper problems, because the symptoms can be fairly similar. In terms of magnesium, magnesium is also important because it is the center of the chlorophyll molecule. And so if you don't have enough nitrogen, you will get interveinal chlorosis, and that's what that would kind of begin to look like. And then as it progresses, then the leaf will just begin to die. You don't need a whole lot, but we need some in that plant. So roughly, again, a little more than a tenth of the nitrogen level would probably be enough in that. And lastly, we have to look at calcium, and calcium is immobile in plants. So we're going to see a deficiency higher on the plant than we would otherwise. And we need a lot of calcium in the soil because it is not easy for the plant to pick it up. And so we really need that root literally run into it to be able to get it up and taken up into the plant. And so that's why on the cation exchange capacity, we want 60 to 80% of the nutrients on the exchange site to be calcium, so that we can get that into the plant. It's needed in the root formation, it's needed in cell wall integrity. And so this would be kind of a picture of what you might envision a deficient cannabis plant to look like in calcium, that the tops would be kind of chlorotic and looking kind of sad. Sulfur is another plant that's kind of similar to that too, in that we need sulfur for amino acid formation in plants. And it tends to also be only moderately mobile or relatively immobile in plants. So again, look for the new growth for the chlorosis. And if you see that, and again, we don't need very, very much sulfur, but we need some. So keep those things in mind, and that's where we'll be. In terms of overall, our recommendations, we recommended this year on an average of about 45, 46 pounds of phosphorus or P2O5 in our recommendations, about an average of 240 pounds of potassium. And I'm sorry, no, the recommendations were 44 and 110. These were the levels that we found in the soil. So again, they were fairly high levels, particularly for phosphorus, since it was already, since 40 is considered optimum. I apologize for that. So, and so our highest recommendations are generally about 70 pounds for P2O5 and 150 pounds of K2O. And our highest lime requirement recommendation was about 7,000 pounds. Micronutrients in cannabis will usually kind of take care of themselves for the most part. If we keep that pH where we want it to be in the low sixes, and you've had a field that's had any history of manure applications, I would not be too concerned about micronutrients. The one that might be a bit problematic is boron, because you'll see boron deficiency in the new growth of the plant, and it kind of starts at the core of the plant, and then it moves out, as you can see there. And the trick with boron is that you need just a wee little bit, and too much is too much. And boron toxicity can end up reflecting what we typically think of as potassium deficiency. So you got to be really careful. And if you put too much on, the plant will definitely suffer, and that's not good either. So keep that in mind, that just a little bit of boron goes a long way. And again, when we go out in the field and we're walking our fields and we're looking at plants, we need, if I looked at this plant here, I might first say, well, geez, that looks a whole lot like that might be either nitrogen deficiency or potassium deficiency. I'm seeing a little firing, a little lower plant yellowing. But then I look up on this leaf, and what's that little guy right there? That's a leaf hopper, right? And so we got to be really careful. What is leaf hopper damage? And so one field that I spent a fair amount of time in Colorado walking, I saw that this plant had one set of leaves that looked damaged, and then the rest of it looked fine. And I would led me to assume that we had a flight of leaf hoppers. They did their damage, and then they went on their merry way. So keep that in mind. And also, if you're out in the field and you look down and you see this plant, like what the heck's going on in this particular plant relative to the others? Well, if it's only happening in one plant, it could be a viral problem, a virus issue. It could just be that in a population of cannabis plants, you're going to have some outlier weirdos. And that's probably what this guy was either a virus infected plant or a cannabis weirdo. I'm not sure which. I'll wrap up by saying this USDA THC rule has to go. It's going to kill us if we don't. I think we really need to increase demand and increase the local. And then I think we need more research done by physicians to look at the sort of lower amounts of CBD dosing to see its effect on pain management and seizure, and more breeding research to get more consistency within our varieties. I think all of those things would really help us. With that was going to be my last slide. So
there are a few questions if you're ready for questions. Michael Rooney wants to know, can we build organic matter with cover crops that will work as well as manure?
That's a really good question. And I think what I like to say about cover crops is cover crops do a really good job to, I got the same thing. I got the music too, Heather.
Yeah.
So what I like to do with cover crops, my feeling is that they protect what you have. And any opportunity you have to use a cover crop to, whether it's going to be a winter killed cover crop like peas and oats, if you could pull a crop off, hit that, and then come in and plant your hemp the next year, you're continuing to feed microorganisms in that soil, which is really important. The root exudates, keep them happy. You keep a good positive balance of good microorganisms in that soil. But it's really hard to get enough biomass to ever think you're going to really increase soil organic matter, in my opinion, over the long term. If you plant a cover crop like peas and oats, we went out and sampled our field in October, and we had about 250 pounds of dry matter in our cover crop. We had a really good catch. It did pretty well, got, maybe that tall, but 250 pounds, if you're going to burn off 90% of that in mineralization, you really only have, 25 pounds of actual, dry matter going into that soil. That's going to be residual. It's going to be a long haul to really increase that over time. But that cover crop's presence there protects. When we get erosion, it's often the good soil that runs and the organic matter that runs off of that field. So I will never, ever discredit the value of cover crops. I just don't think you can build soil organic matter unless you dedicate dedicate a whole year to just growing them and mowing them and incorporating it.
All right. Let's see what else we have here. What do you think about molasses solution sprays on maturing plants? Molasses is high in K. Do you have any thoughts on that, John? Spraying
I do.
molasses?
I use molasses at home in the latter part of the flowering, in probably in the middle of August on. I'll use it about every other week, and I like it because it is a good mineral source. Unsulfured molasses is good, and what I think it's doing, my theory is that you're putting in, and I don't put it on the plant, I put it at the base of the plant, and as in the irrigation water that I'll give it. And what I think is happening is that it tends to promote, it's a good soluble carbon source, and I think the microbes see it, they eat it, they grow, it's a party, they do what little microbes do and have lots of little microbes, and then those little microbes need to have nitrogen in their structure, so they absorb that nitrogen, temporarily immobilize that nitrogen, and then when you harvest off your plant, you have that's, I think it's still the best tool that I know of, short of, at least it seems like it's a logical tool for me in that role. I don't think it's going to make your plants yield better necessarily. I don't think it's going to make, I was talking to somebody the other day and they said, well, it's got to make your flower sweeter, right? I don't think it does that either, but I do think it can tie up some nitrogen, which could be helpful as you want the plant to see more phosphorus than at that time than you do nitrogen. That's my thought. Anybody else have a thought on that?
The only thing we've been trying to figure out a bit is how these foliar sprays are impacting disease,
Right.
and growth of microbes on the flower buds. And I'm there's people using compost teas and molasses and a variety of other tricks and tools to spray on the plants that are making their way onto flower buds, and we're starting to wonder how that's impacting disease, but also microbial counts, which people are asking for. Some states require that
Right.
information, and some buyers. So yeah, just something to think about. We don't know the answer, but
Yeah,
it
we
seems to be
don't.
impacting some of those.
I know personally, I do everything I can to keep my plants moisture free.
Yeah.
I can put the water at the base of the plant. I'm happy. If I can't, I don't want to put anything on the flower as it's going. And that's where we ran into so much trouble this year, was because the powdery mildew came on during flower and people didn't have anything that they could do about it. And,
Right.
and that was a real issue, and will probably continue to be one.
Yeah, I mean, I very preliminarily this year, we did look at some biologicals applied to prevent disease, and it certainly increased the yeast and mold counts way beyond those plants that were not sprayed.
Right.
And it actually, at least the materials we used, did not suppress disease either. So anyway, just more things we need to know and learn about. There is a bunch of very interesting information. Thanks, Willie, for adding in some commentary into the Q&A. Not really questions per se, but just observations and feedback on fertility, and some interactions with other nutrients. There is a question about how do you conduct field drainage tests on a budget? I don't know.
I think I would just pretty much, I would start with the web soil survey, figure out what you got. And then if you think you're going to have wet feet, it's probably worth trying to put some drainage in, because no matter what you're going to grow, I've seen, and short of, upland rice or something, I think it would be beneficial to have that soil have some drainage. And I think as we move forward with the climatic variability that we're having, we either seem to have like no rain or way too much. And so if you have way too much, having that drainage will help. And if you don't have enough, having irrigation is real important. And we've just started a new drought assessment and irrigation needs assessment across commodities, trying to capture a little of that and trying to understand that better. But that's what I would say to anybody is if you can afford it and just go ahead and put the drainage in. I just don't think it can hurt you.
Do you have any opinion on using azomite for mineral supplementation and worm growth in soil?
I don't have any experience with that. I can't address it. Can you?
I can't. I don't know if anyone else has used azomite on the call. You can type it in the chat if you want, or the Q&A box.
There, I know we often serve on the Maine Board of Pesticide Control, and we're frequently have issues where people are using something from a fertility perspective that also has pesticidal properties, and we have to be concerned about label following. So just kind of, that's my only word of caution to the listeners today, that if you have you got to make sure there are more products available for hemp production than there are for cannabis production. But keep it in mind that just make sure that whatever you're using has, if you're using it from a fertility perspective, we used to say the Board of Pesticide Control staff never wanted to try to be the mind police. So if you're using it for something that has pesticidal properties, but your purpose is fertility, just be careful. I guess that's all I'll say, is just be careful, because you don't want to get in trouble with your agency.
Great. One last question. Any tips for a chicken manure recipe for the chicken owners that are in the class and they understand that, it can be a hot product, but any tips?
If it's at all possible that you can save your chicken manure and use it as a compost stimulator, like to stimulate the compost process. So if you got a fair amount of, green or brown vegetation you want to break down, and you would like to, and you have time with it, if you can use it in that sort of a means, I think that can be really, really advantageous. Because it's a great nitrogen source, it's just not a good soil building source. And it can be too hot to be used, directly. So that would be one way you could do it. I could imagine you could try to use it, dilute it, dilute it, and you might be able to get something out of it. I don't know if you have any other thoughts, Heather, but
yeah, I mean, fall applying is always a way to also,
yes.
even though you will lose some of the nitrogen, if you have a cover crop in there, that can just help tame it down a bit before the next year.
Yeah, and if you can get it on that, put it on a growing cover crop, it will definitely make that cover crop do better, and let that cover crop go as long as possible. That ought to be good.
Yeah, see, it looks like any good soil recipe for containers. I don't know if anybody has any thoughts on that. Anybody on the call or John? We haven't done much in containers, but other people may have.
I mean, I have grown a plant in a container just because I thought it'd be fun to do. And the one thing I learned was that I never cease to be amazed at how big these plants can get. And so if you are going to use a container, my first suggestion would be go big, go with the big container. And then, and I used potting soil with compost. I used, I put in some soil bacteria that I thought would be useful in the mix, and I just pretty much mix it up, and then I will feed that with fish emulsion, and every other week or so I'll give it a shot of fish emulsion, and that's usually the way I've worked it. So I don't know if that really helps or not, but about 3 to 4 parts of potting soil and about 1 part of compost is what I've tried to shoot for. And I did
Great.
mine.
Thanks. Thanks everybody. Thoughts on Hogelter? I don't even know what that is.
Hugel culture.
Hugel culture.
Hugel culture. Yeah.
That sounds foreign and exotic.
It's a good German. I come from some German stock. That's how I can recognize what that is. German Irish stock. But I have seen people, so that is a process where if you like build up your soil with wood and brush, and you build this like lasagna-like approach and then plant into it. I've seen some stuff on where they do that in indoor growing now. That way they don't have to use so much soil to fill their pots or fill their beds when they're growing inside. But I don't have any real experience with it except just what I've seen. And I think if you're I would definitely read up and really understand what I was doing with it if I were going to try to practice it. I don't practice it. My own home garden and my fields, when we're doing it on a field basis or something like that, I don't know that there would be a place for that, but on a small garden scale, you might be able to find some value and be able to save a little bit of money in your production because you're not having to buy so much potting soil and that kind of thing. That might be an advantage. And there's probably some carbon tie-ups, so be careful about that.
Yeah. Well, great. I think that's all the questions. Again, thanks, Willie, for everything in the Q&A box. You make many good points. I think everybody can see those. One interesting observation that we have also observed and have actually seen in our trials is that too much fertility is not a good thing. Too much nitrogen, especially on many of our dairy farm fields, people that are growing hemp and they have just lots of residual organic N, and this certainly may be lengthening the flower time. That's a really good point. We definitely don't see any increased yields by adding more nitrogen on those types of fields, and could certainly be leading to many other issues. So really, soil management and fertility management is very complicated. Not as easy as just growing a cover crop or adding some manure, as you can tell. And there's lots to consider: the background fertility, the drainage, the soil type, um, and then really thinking about what kind of amendments are going to make the most sense given various constraints and availability in your area. Willie also mentions, cover cropping is a way you can build soil organic matter, which it certainly is. It does, it can take more time, especially with the short-term cover crops that we often see here in Vermont. But combining that with minimal tillage and just really having something growing on those fields all year long helps build soil health and organic matter and overall productivity. And the last comment that Willie makes is about mycorrhizae fungi, um, and the ability for mycorrhizae to help access nutrients and protect plants. Um, and there's a variety of products out there. We've actually been experimenting with a number of them at UVM. I think it often can be harder to see treatment effects of certain products out in the field because there's so much going on in your soil. But within container systems, certainly many amendments certainly can help. And as you can tell, we have a lot of research to do still, and just trying to bring to you what we know and really everything we don't know yet. And so appreciate people's feedback like yours, Willie, and anybody else who has, experience and information to offer. It helps us all, and certainly appreciate that. So with that, thank you, John. It was great.
My pleasure.
Lots of good information, and it looks like everybody enjoyed.